CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. At least 42 people have died in Germany and dozens more are missing as record rainfall sweeps Europe.
Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel's last visit to the United States as Chancellor, strengthening transatlantic ties.
The EU row with Poland and Hungary over gay rights intensifies. Brussels begins legal action against the two member countries.
China's economic rebound from the coronavirus pandemic has now slowed, according to official figures.
And South Africans count the cost of arson and looting that's now claimed more than 70 lives.
Do you think I'm going to sleep tonight when I see this? Do you think I'm going to be able to just close my eyes and sleep?
More than 40 people have now died and dozens more are missing after record rainfall and flooding in Germany. Homes have been swept away as swollen rivers burst their banks in what have been described as catastrophic conditions.
Hundreds of soldiers have been deployed to help the rescue effort. Well, our correspondent Trent Murray is in Ahrweiler outside of Bonn. So, Trent, what's the latest?
Well, Robin, as we go to air, a major search and rescue operation remains underway here in northwest Germany after those devastating floods hit the region on Wednesday night. We understand, as you say, that at least 42 people have died so far and dozens more are missing. So the priority now for police and emergency services here is to continue those helicopter flyovers to see if they can find any more people that may be stuck on their roofs or trapped in their homes. Police also going door to door. Here where I am in Ahrweiler, in this village, locals tell me that they simply had no time to escape these raging torrents. At around 11 o'clock local time last night, the waters began rising rapidly, many of them taking shelter where they can up on the roofs of their buildings. Inside the old town here, just behind me, you might be able to see there is still water lying about, and all of the shops that are in there have been pretty well devastated. Furniture strewn across the streets, cars have been tipped upside down. Businesses all but destroyed, and many of the people I've spoken to say that they cannot stay here tonight. There is no running water, no electricity, and so they are trying to find friends or family that might be able to take them in nearby cities. As you might imagine, with such a dramatic and frightening event that we saw, there are stories now emerging of some very close escapes for people in this region. One of them is Edgar Gillison. He told us just how scary the night was.
I was standing up there and I was looking down here, how it was flowing through. Our community centre just crushed and it struck the bridge over there now. And a 40-ton truck must be stuck in there as well. A house was standing over there and tilted entirely. You can't imagine. You know this from TV or elsewhere. Nothing like this.
Just one of many stories that are starting to emerge from the scene here. One woman as well told me tragically that as she was evacuated today, she saw the body of her dead neighbour as she left. Unfortunately, she was unable to escape in time from these rising waters.
And Trent, the weather where you are holding at the moment by the looks of things, but is more rain expected?
Yeah, that's right, Robin. There has been some respite in the weather today, which has helped rescue efforts, but the German Weather Service is saying more rain is on the way. They don't expect it to be as heavy as we saw last night, but it will hamper some of those rescue efforts if there is more of those sudden downpours. As I say, the priority now is not just that rescue operation, but to also take care of those people who can't stay in their homes. As I say, villages like this one are virtually uninhabitable right now, so cities like Frankfurt and Cologne and Bonn nearby are taking in people from this area. I suspect in coming days as well there will start to be some questions being asked about the Weather Service's warnings. Some people here telling me they did know that rain was coming, but they didn't feel like they were warned that it could be just this heavy and this devastating.
OK, Trent Murray in Arveiler, thanks very much indeed.
Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel has pledged government help for those affected by those floods. She's currently in Washington on her last official visit to the United States and will meet President Joe Biden later. Merkel is preparing to stand down after leading Germany for 16 years. Our correspondent Giles Gibson is in Washington for us. Giles, what's expected from Angela Merkel's last visit?
Well, Jamie, Angela Merkel has worked with 4 different US presidents over the course of her time in office. And in this latest meeting with the latest US President Joe Biden, the White House says they're going to be discussing climate change, COVID-19, security and regional challenges, shoring up democracy around the world, among other topics. And that phrase, among other topics, from the White House is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because there are certainly points of tension right now between the US and the German governments. Chief among those is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, this pipeline that will carry natural gas directly from Russia to Germany, bypassing the traditional route that goes through Ukraine. The Biden administration has been very critical of that project. They say that it's going to give Russian President Vladimir Putin leverage over both Germany as well as the wider region of Western Europe. And China is certainly another point of difference between the Biden administration and the Merkel administration. We've seen the Germans trying to be much more cooperative with China. Of course, China is a very big market for German companies, whereas, as we've seen over the last few months, the Biden administration has been much more confrontational in terms of its language and its dealings with Beijing.
Giles, she's been the dominant figure in European politics for a generation without Angela Merkel at the helm. What's the future course for US-German relations?
Well, Angela Merkel has really been this anchor for the US-German relationship over her time in office, as these different US presidents with different styles have come and gone from the White House. There have certainly been some difficult times over the years. Just take, for example, Angela Merkel being very publicly critical of the decision during the George W. Bush administration to invade Iraq. We also saw during Donald Trump's presidency a lot of tension between Merkel and Trump. Donald Trump repeatedly criticizing Germany in public over the level of its contributions to the NATO alliance and the NATO budget. Of course, we know already, with Angela Merkel announcing that she'll step down, that there will be a new German chancellor after the German elections, which are coming up in September. But we're not really expecting any sort of upheaval in the US-Germany relationship, whatever the result of those elections are. And that's just because the 3 major parties in Germany, Merkel's CDU, the Social Democrats and the Greens, are all very strongly supportive of this relationship, this strong relationship with Washington.
Giles Gibson in Washington, thank you very much.
The EU is launching legal action against 2 of its member countries. Brussels says Poland and Hungary have broken EU law by discriminating against their own LGBT citizens. Let's talk now to our correspondent Penelope Liersch in Budapest. So, Penny, what's the latest?
Well, it's a new law in Hungary that has partly brought about this legal action. Last week, the anti-LGBTQ law was implemented and is now running in the country. It bans the promotion and any display of homosexuality or gender change to those under the age of 18. Essentially, this means schools cannot teach sexual education in the same way, and it means the media is restricted in representation of the LGBT community as well. Now, it's received huge amounts of criticism from European leaders, the majority condemning Hungary over this legislation and calling for there to be action taken against the government. We've seen it on a number of levels for breaching fundamental rights of the Union, for breaching human rights. There's also major criticism that this law conflates issues around pedophilia with issues in the LGBT community. So very strong criticism has been coming for a long time, and we've seen in Poland as well a similar situation where there have been areas set up in more than 100 regions that are branded as LGBT free. Now the Commission is concerned that of course is discrimination as well, and that's why they've brought forward this legal action against both countries. Both of the governments will be receiving letters from the Commission. They'll have 2 months to respond to those adequately. If they don't, they could end up before the European Court of Justice, which is the highest court in the European Union, and that's probably what is likely to happen. So far we've seen the Hungarian government very strongly defend this legislation. They knew that this legal challenge was coming today, and they said that it would still be in vain any attempt to force them to repeal this law, and that it's up to the rights of parents to decide who is educating their children and what they're being educated about. Poland has also previously denied that their country discriminates against anyone based on sexual orientation. Robin?
Well, meanwhile, Penny, there are not one but two court cases pitting the EU and Poland against each other. Tell us about those.
Well, this is a long-running power struggle as well. Basically, today, the European Court of Justice has ruled that judicial tribunals set up in Poland to discipline judges must not be allowed to continue to run, that they're infringing on the independence of the judiciary, and that's breaking the rules of the European Union. Now, previously, Poland has received this verdict before as well, but they've continued to run those tribunals. And yesterday, Poland held their own hearing to decide which law stood above the other, basically, finding that Polish constitutional law was above the decisions of the ECJ. That's certainly not how the European Court of Justice sees it, again enforcing today that their decision must be implemented and those rules must be followed, or further action may be taken against Poland. Potentially there could be funds withheld from the EU, but that is a very hard process to get off the ground. It hasn't happened yet, and it would require support from Hungary. So a very long way to go in this battle between these two countries and the powers in Brussels.
Penelope Liesch, many thanks.
The European Union's top court has ruled that companies can ban the wearing of headscarves under certain conditions. It says bans are acceptable if they're justified by an employer's need to present a neutral image. However, they must also consider staff rights, including freedom of religion. The case was brought by two women in Germany suspended from their jobs for wearing a hijab.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson promises to spread wealth and opportunity to poorer areas beyond London, but his critics describe it as nonsense.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
China's economic recovery from the pandemic continues, but at a slower pace compared with the beginning of the year. The first half of 2021 saw the world's second biggest economy expand overall by 12.7%. But there was an expected slowdown in the pace of growth in the second quarter. GDP grew at 18.3% year-on-year from January to March, and that was largely due to a low starting point as China's economy took a hit at the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020. The second quarter saw GDP growth drop to 7.9%. Then let's take a look at foreign trade. For the first half of 2021, imports and exports increased more than 27% compared to a year earlier, buoyed by an increase in global commodity prices. That's despite shipping disruption caused by regional virus outbreaks. Now, an interesting trend to look at here, global holdings of Chinese stocks and bonds have surged about 40% to more than $800 billion over the last year. That's a record pace for global investors buying up Chinese assets. Well, Sue Ewers from the Economics Intelligence Unit, I asked her if the second quarter results mean China's economic recovery is slowing down.
The difference is actually because of the low base effect last year when China's economy is being hit by the COVID-19. But the indicators that we are looking at is the two-year average growth. So in Q2, if we look at the two-year average growth compared with Q2 in 2019, you will find the growth rate is around 5.5%, very close to the trend growth before the pandemic, suggesting the economy is running relatively well.
What action do you expect China to take to try and encourage domestic consumption? Because I noticed Prime Minister Premier Li has warned against what he described as flood-like stimulus. And that's the temptation here, isn't it? You turn the taps on and that will kind of fix it. It may not.
In the second half of this year, Chinese government will implement very targeted policy to stimulate domestic consumption. So one consideration might be providing subsidies to encourage households to purchase new environmental friendly house appliances. This is one way to boost retail sales of consumer goods. And the second thing that Chinese government might consider is to encourage tourism visit, because the people still cannot travel abroad. And the third thing I think is definitely going to happen is the tightening regulation on house speculation will still exist, so that people don't need to borrow much money to purchase house and spend money, and instead spend money on consumption.
Foreign trade seems to be performing relatively well despite this extraordinary global semiconductor shortage, the chip shortage, and the possibility of this resurging pandemic threat around the world.
Foreign trade has actually performed very well, despite that in many countries that we're seeing the third and fourth waves of the COVID-19. But actually, China actually benefit from the economic lockdown elsewhere in the world is because the lockdown actually generate demand for electronic products and house furnitures, which all boost China's exports. Car export also increased because people want to avoid traveling via public vehicles. Once the COVID-19 continues to recover at the rest of the world, China's export will be able to maintain such momentum because of genuine recovery of global economy that will definitely boost China's export demand. So we still believe that in the second half of this year, current account surplus will continue to contribute positively to China's GDP.
Senators in the United States have passed a bill banning the import of goods from China's Xinjiang Autonomous Region. American firms that source goods from Xinjiang have been warned they'll face possible legal action. Let's go live now to New York and our correspondent John Terrett. So John, tell us more about the Senate bill.
Well, hey, Robin. Hey, Jamie. This Senate bill has only one aim, and that is to prevent U.S. corporations, and by dint of the fact that the U.S. is as big as it is, other corporations around the world quite possibly as well, from profiting from Xinjiang in any way. Xinjiang, of course, from this perspective in New York and Washington, D.C., is seen as an area in China where there are widespread human rights abuses. The allegations are bipartisan, which means they come from the Republican side and the Democratic side as well. And this bill basically accuses the Chinese in Xinjiang of human rights abuses against the Uyghurs and other Muslim groups in the area, and by extension, therefore, the use of some forced labor in products that are made in the Xinjiang region. And indeed, this bill has the title Uyghur Forced Labor Act. And built in it is something called a rebuttal presumption. And what that means is that the bill assumes that all products made in the Xinjiang region are therefore put together in one way or another using forced labor. And if that is true, it infringes the 1930 Tariff Act. Now, what is new about this bill, which has just exited the Senate, is that it transfers the burden of proof onto the companies who are doing the buying. So, in other words, the buyers that come out from U.S. corporations to China to see the wares that they're going to buy and import into the United States, the burden of proof will transfer to them now to make sure that there is no forced labor being used. At the moment, the situation at the moment is something called reasonable evidence, which you can see is far more vague. But the burden of proof transfers to the corporations now. A handful of global companies are already wrapped up in this. Off the top of my head, I can think of a number of French haute couture companies, also Nike here in the United States, and H&M, which is based in Sweden. Now, this bill has now exited the Senate. It's on the way to the House of Representatives. I have no date for when a vote might be appointed in the House for this, but it is likely to pass for all the reasons we've discussed on this program on many occasions before. There is kind of bipartisan support for going after China in Washington, D.C. at the moment. Not surprisingly, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing is pretty angry about this and has been hitting back within the last 12 hours. Take a listen to what they had to say.
The true intentions behind the U.S. repeatedly bringing up these claims is to disrupt Xinjiang's prosperity and stability, and to deprive people there of their right to live, work and growth. The U.S. is committing forced unemployment and forced poverty. This bill fully exposes the U.S.'s evil intentions of using Xinjiang to contain China.
And John, US President Biden is extending the Trump ban on trade talks.
Yes, now there have been regular trade talks since the Bush 43 era here. Bush 41 was his dad, George H.W. Bush. 43 was W. Bush. And ever since his time in office, which was 2001 through 2008, we've had regular talks going on with sometimes the American side sitting up all night talking, sometimes the Chinese side sitting up all night talking. And then those talks were halted by President Trump for various reasons, which I can't really remember now, back in 2017, 2018. Well, now Biden and his Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen are extending that ban. Janet Yellen had one virtual sit-down with Liu He, who is the chief trade negotiator, obviously vice premier, but obviously the man who drives the Chinese trade negotiations. She had one sit-down with him back on June the 1st. It was cordial, we are told. But now further evidence that the Biden administration seems to be very tough on China in all sorts of ways previously thought largely unthinkable. Many Chinese watchers here say that extending this ban on trade talks at the sort of diplomatic general level is not the way to go forward, and that the U.S. may end up ruining the day. But there is hope on the horizon. There are reports out there of a possible President Xi-Joe Biden conference, a summit. Now, what gives hope to this is that Wendy Sherman, who's the State Department number 2, is going to meet with Xi Feng, who is the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, next week. And that will do one of two things, it is being reported. Either pave the way for a Xi-Biden summit, or at least pave the way for the next phase of the Biden administration's policy towards Beijing. Robin and Jamie?
John, thank you. John Terrett there in New York.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has promised to spread wealth and opportunity beyond London as he set out his flagship Levelling Up programme. Britain's main opposition party criticised his speech, calling it gibberish. Juliet Mann reports.
If much of your local shopping parade looks like this, the UK government's regeneration plans will appeal. Light on detail, the Prime Minister's vow to level up is his big picture vision to restore pride in left-behind areas of the country and ultimately stoke economic growth.
So, levelling up is not a jam-spreading operation. It's not robbing Peter to pay Paul, it's not zero-sum, it's win-win for the whole United Kingdom. And so this is the plan, and I will believe that we've made progress on levelling up when we've begun to raise living standards, spread opportunity, improved our public services and restored people's sense of pride in their community across the whole of the UK.
Speaking from a battery factory in the West Midlands was a nod to his ambition to turn the country into a science superpower with high-tech, high-wage jobs. He pledged to give local leaders the tools they need to make things happen.
Now is the time to do even better. And there is one final ingredient. The most important factor in levelling up. The yeast that lifts the whole mattress of dough, the magic sauce, the ketchup of catch-up. And that is leadership.
The opposition Labour Party described the Prime Minister's speech as gibberish nonsense. The party's deputy leader, Angela Rayner, called it a PR exercise. But making pavement licences for pubs and cafes permanent is one way to back business and boost community pride. More policy detail will be announced in the autumn. The Prime Minister talked about getting the basics right, investing in grassroots sport, upgrading transport, cutting crime and making the whole country more attractive to investment. What he didn't talk about was how much he's planning on spending or where the funds will come from to pay for it all. And levelling up needs money to back it up. Juliet Mann, CGTN, London.
The number of people on British payrolls surged by 350,000 last month to more than 28 million. It's the biggest rise in employment since the pandemic, driven by thousands more jobs in food, accommodation and administration as people returned to work after restrictions were eased. Job vacancies in the 3 months to June also rose by more than 77,000.
The British-based banking and payments app Revolut has become the UK's most valuable private tech company. The digital startup raised $800 million in a funding round, led by SoftBank's Vision Fund 2 and Tiger Global Management. The deal values the firm at $33 billion, 6 times more than its fundraising earlier last year. It's now worth more than NatWest, one of the UK's big 4 retail banks.
Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company says it's planning to build new factories in the United States and Japan amid a surge in demand for electronic components. It also wants to boost production on the Chinese mainland.
Beyond Meat has opened its first online shop on China's e-commerce platform JD.com. The US plant-based food company is looking to establish a presence in 4 Chinese cities initially before expanding to 33.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Spain pays tribute to frontline healthcare workers who lost their lives battling the pandemic.
the EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas. Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we try to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN. Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories: at least 42 people have died in Germany and dozens more are missing as record rainfall sweeps Europe.
The EU's row with Poland and Hungary over gay rights intensifies. Brussels begins legal action against the two member countries.
And China's economic rebound from the coronavirus pandemic has now slowed. That's according to official figures.
The head of the World Health Organization has asked China to cooperate and be transparent as part of investigations into the origins of coronavirus. All 194 member states will be briefed on Friday on a proposed second phase of a study into the pandemic.
I think we owe it to the millions who suffered and to the millions who died really to understand what happened. And I hope there will be better cooperation. And we have continued the engagement with China and also with member states.
China says it has always cooperated with the WHO in an open, transparent and scientific manner. Meanwhile, 48 nations signed a joint letter to the WHO on Thursday in which they opposed any politicisation of coronavirus's origins.
Spain has paid tribute to frontline health workers who lost their lives during the fight against COVID-19. King Felipe led the commemorations at Madrid's Royal Palace. Our correspondent Rahul Pathak is there for us. Rahul, an important day and a moving ceremony.
Yeah, hi there, Jamie. It certainly was. The King Felipe used the word solemn, and that's exactly what the ceremony held at the Royal Palace to my right was. An extremely solemn affair with the King, the Queen, the Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, and 700 other dignitaries, all paying tribute to those people who lost their lives during the pandemic, and in particular the 120 healthcare workers who sadly died after contracting COVID-19. Here's my report. A minute's silence for the 80,000 plus victims of the pandemic. Spain's King Felipe and Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez remembering those who've lost their lives to COVID-19.
Mostrar del modo más solemne
We want to show in the most solemn way our deep respect, recognition and admiration for health workers who from the very beginning of this crisis tirelessly worked with determination and complete devotion, trying to contain a disease that at that time we had no treatment or vaccines for. Today we feel again the emotion of being together in memory of everyone who died.
The fight continues, and the latest explosion in infection rates is now causing real concern. The main spikes have been in the younger population, driven by the Delta variant. Regional governments like Valencia and Catalonia have now reintroduced measures such as nighttime curfews to stem the rate of infection. Well, here on the frontline fight against the pandemic, the government has made real progress. Over 75% of all those aged 40 and over have now been fully vaccinated, so now they're turning their attention to the younger generation. The We Think Centre is one of the largest vaccination centres in Madrid, and for the staff here and at other vaccination points around the country, it's a race against the clock. In 2 weeks, the majority of Spaniards will leave for their holidays, and potentially huge numbers of British tourists could also arrive. They plan to vaccinate as many over 18s as they can.
The priority now and the aim of our strategy is still to vaccinate as many people as possible. Most importantly, those age groups that move and travel the most, as they are the ones who are most at risk. The more elderly age groups are already vaccinated, so we can focus on those with more mobility that could keep spreading the virus. So basically, that means the younger members of the population.
As it stands, less than 20% of those under 30 have received a single vaccination. Health officials are extremely concerned that the summer period will once again be followed by a deadly wave of infections. Well, as you heard in my report, we are already seeing evidence of, dare I say it, a fifth wave of the pandemic here in Spain. Some reports describing the Delta variant as running wild amongst unvaccinated young people, particularly in Catalonia and in the northeast of the country. Many of those regions having to close nightclubs, reimpose nighttime curfews, and Catalonia, in fact, has asked for permission from their local courts for permission to close or to reimpose a nighttime curfew. And speaking of the courts, Spain's top court has actually ruled with a very, very slim majority, I hasten to add, that last year's national lockdown imposed by the central government here in Madrid, the national lockdown was actually unconstitutional. Now, if you do remember, the national lockdown came in March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it basically meant that everybody had to stay at home unless for absolutely essential reasons. Now, the case was brought by the extreme right-wing Vox party, which I think tells you an awful lot. This is more about the political polarisation of politics here in Spain, and I think political point scoring is the main factor here rather than protecting civil liberties. But the decision has been made by the courts. The government apparently are absolutely furious, but they say they're going to look at the ruling in more detail over the coming days before deciding on what further action to take. Because if the decision does go through and it's carried through to its natural conclusion, it could open a door for thousands of people who are fined for breaking lockdown rules to try and claim that money back, which would cause chaos in the courts. Back to you.
Thank you very much indeed.
The UK has recorded almost 50,000 new coronavirus cases, the highest daily rate in 6 months. It comes as England prepares to remove most remaining restrictions next week. And with the lockdown about to be lifted, it was hoped the starting gun would be fired on summer holiday season. But as our correspondent Naweed Jabarkal reports, that's not how things turned out.
Those in the UK dreaming of a summer holiday may be disappointed at the government's latest changes to its traffic light system. Only 2 locations have been added onto the green list, which means no quarantining on return. That's Bulgaria and Hong Kong. In the case of the latter, British tourists aren't even allowed in because of concerns over the Delta variant. It's led to widespread criticism from the industry, which was hoping more travel would open up.
I think the challenge we have is all these changing rules, because that's what's really undermining consumer confidence. Like, we're really at a peak season when it comes to travel, particularly in regions like Europe and the UK. So the next, say, 6 weeks are really significant.
As part of the latest changes, popular tourist destinations like Spain's Balearic Islands, which include Ibiza and Mallorca, are going back on the amber list. That means 10 days of self-isolation at home from Monday. But one key change on the same day will mean those who've been double vaccinated or are under 18 will no longer need to quarantine at all if arriving from amber list countries, places like Portugal, Italy and Greece.
The science is proving that these vaccines work even against the variant. So there's no reason why, if people are going back to their lives, back to their offices, back to their pretty much normal activities, why would we not allow people to go on a trip, whether it's for business or leisure?
For the industry and indeed many ordinary people here itching to go on holiday, the government system makes little sense. There are calls for more transparency behind what's driving these decisions, especially given that many locations currently have far lower infection rates than the UK. With around 40,000 cases a day here and rising, it's not just about what goes out from here, but concerns about new variants that could be brought in.
From Monday, thousands of British people will start jetting off abroad once again, even though the official guidance says that's risky. But for a global industry battered by COVID-19, the uncertainty will weigh on the sector. The World Travel and Tourism Council says 62 million jobs were lost last year, and that more could follow. Luigi Barkil, CGTN, London.
The South African government is planning to deploy 25,000 troops following 6 days of looting and violence. At least 72 people have died and thousands have been arrested as buildings and vehicles were destroyed across cities including Durban and Johannesburg. Vigilante citizens have been rooting out suspected looters and turning them over to the police. A clean-up is now underway while businesses struggle to come to terms with their losses. Stores were ransacked, livelihoods ruined and businesses torched. The unrest has also hit supply chains and transport links, leading to food and fuel shortages.
Do you think I'm going to sleep tonight when I see this? Do you think I'm going to be able to just close my eyes and sleep? Why don't I just sleep forever? It's over. It's over. I've got overheads. I owe banks money.
I still need to pay my rent. I got 3 kids I need to take care of. How will I take care of my kids?
Some observers have described the riots as an insurrection. David Everett is a professor of urban governance at Wits University in Johannesburg.
The events that have unfolded are the building blocks towards an insurrection that failed. That doesn't mean there won't be other attempts. But I do think that what we've witnessed has been a deliberate set of steps in order to trigger the destabilization of the population, of industry, of telecommunications, of services. That is the first step towards a full-on insurrection, which would have culminated, of course, in former President Zuma being released from prison, current president being removed, and we would have probably had President Zuma back in the seat of power, or someone who listened to him.
So how much of this is down to Zuma and his supporters, and how much is due to other factors?
To be fair, I don't think it's just an insurrection. We're an extremely unequal society. We have appalling levels of poverty. We have ongoing racism. When I say racism, people think black-white, but it cuts all sorts of directions. We have xenophobic violence directed towards our African brothers who are trading in South Africa. And so there's incredibly fertile ground for hungry, cold people who've been locked down, like the rest of the world for however many years and months now. We're in stage 4 lockdown as well. And so I think there is a lot of potential on the ground for things to go badly wrong, but most fires need someone to strike a match, and I think what we've been through in South Africa in the last 4 or 5 days is an initial period of saying, oh my word, what's going on? Look at this. And it was all over our TV screens as it was of yours, on yours. But I think in the last 2 days, the conversation here has switched to saying, why did this happen? How did this happen? Was this fomented or was this spontaneous? And increasingly, it's apparent that there were people who knew exactly what they were doing. But part of that is playing on the poverty, the inequality, the racism, all the things that make people angry, upset anyway.
We're now seeing soldiers being called in to help deal with the situation. How significant is this deployment?
It's very significant, and it's also, I mean, if I'm allowed to be honest, fairly scary. Soldiers were deployed about a year ago in our first lockdown in order to manage the curfew and to make sure that people stayed, and people got killed, shot. And so it's with some anxiety that one sees the troops being sent out. There are also calls now for a 24-hour curfew just to lock everyone down, put everyone off the street, out of the shopping malls, etc. The problem with that is it's coming with quite a security kind of presence of mind, not just a way of doing it. I think we need a humanist way of dealing with people who have been duped into these kinds of criminal acts. Without question, there are criminals who need to be sanctioned, but I think there are some genuinely hungry, bewildered people who were told, go loot, nothing will happen to you. And I wouldn't want them to be at the wrong end of the security forces, particularly the troops. On the other hand, the troops are better organized than our police, who have been singularly missing in action.
Authorities in Haiti say they've identified a former senator as a chief suspect in the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. Moïse was shot dead at his home in Port-au-Prince last week by what the police say was a unit of professional killers. 24 people have now been arrested, including 19 Colombians. But officers say key suspects are still on the run.
Plans for a new government in Lebanon have collapsed after its designated new prime minister pulled out of talks. Saad al-Hariri says his proposals for a cabinet reshuffle have been rejected. He says he will not now be able to reach an agreement with President Aoun on forming a new administration.
4 people have been arrested in the UK over online racist abuse towards members of England's football team following Sunday's Euro 2020 final. A hate crime investigation is underway after 3 black players were targeted on social media for missing penalties in the shootout defeat against Italy.
Dutch crime reporter Peter de Vries has died 9 days after being shot in the street in central Amsterdam. He covered many high-profile crimes and was well known for his investigations of mobsters and drug lords. 2 suspects have been detained in connection with the shooting.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the computer games going for gold. Why esports could one day be lining up for the Olympics.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole,
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for the Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Talks on managing migrant flows have been held between Greece and Lithuania at a summit in Athens. The Greek Prime Minister has been hosting his Lithuanian counterpart as fears grow of a mass migrant outflow from Belarus.
These talks come as Greece faces criticism from aid groups over its treatment of migrants on its own borders. Evangelos Ipsas reports now from Athens.
The International Organization for Migration has issued a stark report last week. The number of refugees and asylum seekers who died attempting to cross the Europe on sea routes has doubled. The UN's migration agency says that the number is twice as high in the first 6 months of 2021 when compared to last year. In the report, the IOM writes that close to 1,200 people died between January and June, although it says the number could be higher as shipwrecks are often not reported. Although the agency's tally shows that less than 10 people died en route to Greece on the eastern Mediterranean route, the EU's Commissioner for Home Affairs, Ylva Johansson, has warned Greece to stop the practice of pushbacks in what she describes as violations of fundamental European values. This has angered Athens, which denies any wrongdoing.
Greece is committed to protecting its borders and will continue to do so as a sovereign responsibility in line with EU and international law. We have every right to intercept these crossings in accordance with EU 2014. Greece does not want to be the gateway to Europe for the smuggling networks.
The report that was published last week shows that 741 people died in the sea between Libya and Italy, while 250 people died crossing between West Africa and the Canary Islands. 149 people died on journey to Spain and at least 6 people en route to Greece. As the EU's Commissioner for Home Affairs slams Greek authorities for their stance on the issue, in a press conference on Thursday, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said that Greece will not allow criminal gangs or third-party states to destabilize the European Union.
Neither Greece in the south nor Lithuania in the north wish to be the gateway to Europe for people smuggling networks, or third-party states intend on putting pressure on the European Union. And our clear objective should be to discourage, but also disrupt the dangerous criminal gangs and to stop them putting lives at risk.
While the passage on the eastern Mediterranean route is not as deadly as other parts of southern Europe, NGOs remain worried that the numbers might increase as many of the immigrants will try the journey again, putting their lives at risk. Evangelos Ipsas for CGTN, Athens, Greece.
Thailand is in the midst of a surge in new infections, reporting record highs in recent days.
The outbreak has forced the government to shelve its policy of admitting all COVID patients to hospital, and for the first time, home isolation is now permitted. Tusita Saukau reports.
From dusk till dawn, thousands wait. The colourful tapestry of umbrellas and mats just suppose the mood of those waiting. Free COVID testing starts here at 8 a.m. It's 9 p.m. York, her husband and her 6-month-old daughter are already in line. They have a long wait ahead of them.
Many people in my street have COVID, and someone with COVID came in close contact with my baby. I'm so worried that my daughter will be infected.
The harrowing truth, if they test positive, there will likely be no beds. In the thick of a deadly third wave, lines are growing at COVID testing sites across the city. But these lines signal major problems as the country scrambles for resources. Low testing rates, severe shortage of hospital beds, slow vaccination drive. Thailand's public health system is on the verge of collapse. And this is what it looks like. Increasingly defenseless against the mighty force of Delta. Thailand previously hospitalized all patients, which arguably helped in controlling prior outbreaks. But it wasn't sustainable. Home isolation is now being trialled for the first time to free up medical resources. Piloted by Rabuti Hospital, more than 100 COVID-19 patients with less severe symptoms have consented to home treatment. For 14 days, they are monitored closely using telemedicine.
We select homes that are well ventilated, where the patient lives by themselves or where other family members can keep their distance.
Somchai has been in home isolation for 7 days after testing positive. Meals and medication are delivered to his house daily. For him, it's so far so good.
Being in home isolation is less stressful than being in hospital. I have everything I need here and I can talk to the doctor online.
But this is where home isolation becomes difficult. Around 20% of Bangkok's population live like this, in slum settlements where under one roof, more than 10 people can reside. No partitions, everyone sleeps in one room sharing a single toilet and bathroom. An infection here would have everything it needs to spread. And as cases rise, the reality is that COVID-19 will take a different, more deadly path through these cramped, overcrowded alleys. And the result could be chaos in numbers. Dusita Saogao, CGTN, Bangkok, Thailand.
Now, could video gaming become an Olympic sport? The International Olympic Committee has held its first e-sports series as it looks to reach younger audiences.
Competitors took part in 5 virtual events: baseball, auto racing, cycling, rowing and sailing, just weeks before the real-world games kick off in Tokyo. Maya Yoshida reports.
1, 2, 3 strikes you're out at the new baseball game. It's the finals of the Olympic Virtual Series, or OVS, the first licensed Olympic esports event. Unlike the traditional games, players don't necessarily represent their own countries. Taku is Japanese, but leading Team Australia.
Unless you are a professional athlete, it's impossible to have any connection with the Olympics itself, so I'm flattered. I think a younger audience will increase once video games are involved.
And that's exactly what the IOC wants. Esports is a billion-dollar industry with a rapidly growing audience. That's why the IOC partnered with global sports federations and game makers in an effort to steer the enthusiasm of this young crowd toward the Olympics. And at a time when social distancing is essential, virtual sports also lets organizers promote the Summer Games without risking the safety of players.
We managed to work out all matches smoothly in a short period of time thanks to the virtual and online experts of esports.
The World Baseball Softball Confederation is also hoping these esport games will expand its fan base as it makes a push for the physical games Olympic comeback in 2028 in Los Angeles. Baseball and softball were added to Tokyo 2020 but dropped from Paris 2024.
Is to increase as many touch points as possible with fans, athletes, and we have to be relevant to the society as well. So, in the younger generations, trying to play more e-games in esports, and then we want to be there and we want to provide the opportunity as well.
Even before the pandemic boosted popularity of video games, the head of the IOC said there's room for debate on including esports in the world's biggest sporting event.
So there is a series of questions to which we have no answer yet, and this is why we said we want to get to know each other.
Of course, the Olympics still has a long way to go to fully embrace esports as true sports, but the need for virtual fun has never been more important here in host city Tokyo, where people are encouraged to stay at home. Maya Yoshida for CGTN, Tokyo.
The headlines again. At least 42 people have died in Germany and dozens more are missing as record rainfall sweeps Europe.
The EU's row with Poland and Hungary over gay rights intensifies. Brussels begins legal action against the 2 member countries.
And China's economic rebound from the coronavirus pandemic has now slowed, according to official figures. That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
We're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.